Good morning. My name is Ulrich Beck. I'm a sociologist. I'm normally mostly working in Munich in the Institute of Sociology. I'm a little bit of philosopher as well. And I'm working at the London School of Economics as well, and in Paris in D2. And my main subject is to look and conceptualize the transformations of modernity, not only on a European perspective, but even on a global, or as I would say, cosmopolitan perspective. Well, we are in Paris right now, and it's a wonderful place here actually where we stay. I have an apartment up here, and I have many possibilities to communicate with French sociologists and philosophers, and I really do like it. Well, you asked me I should tell something about my basic ideas of reflexive modernization, which was actually my starting point already 26 years ago. My point of beginning is actually the following one. We don't even have the language to understand the transformations we're experiencing. And this is a major issue because all things which are happening are often conceptualized in old categories. I'm speaking of zombie categories, which are at the same time living and dead categories. One of the symbols for this is the small word post. Everything is post. Post-modernity, post-politics, post-feminism, etc. Post stands actually for the inability, maybe even the laziness of intellectuals to say what is the case. They only say what's not the case, they don't say what is the case. So I tried to find an answer to this basic situation, which I identified long ago, and I said it's about reflexive modernization. With reflexive modernization, I'm arguing that actually the ongoing modernization is producing side effects, risks, all kinds of issues, which in its consequences undermine the institutions of first modernity in relation, for example, to the nation state, but to many other issues as well. So we have actually a revolution of side effects, which is transforming our basic understanding of the world, and it's very difficult to find out about it. I distinguish three main dynamics of this kind of reflexive modernization. The first is with society or world with society. The second is individualization, and the third is what I call cosmopolitization. All of those three dynamics are having the same logic. They are telling us the way in which the radicalized modernization by side effects undermines institutions and our frame of reference to analyze them in sociological terms. Well, rich society is a term I invented a long time ago, and it points at the dynamics which is beyond risk and beyond society. I combine those two words in order to open up to a situation where we are actually producing uncertainties, manufactured uncertainties, which we cannot capture by the old categories like risk and society, because they undermine those basic distinctions, they undermine the principle of insurance, they undermine the distinction between national and internationalism. This is one of the big dynamics, and if you look at the history of, let's say, the past 20 years, you find that lots of the big events which really changed the world fit into this category, or as I would say, into this narrative of risk society. One of the last examples is of course Fukushima as an example potential global catastrophe, which is still to some extent going on, and which demonstrates that this is not only a local issue in Japan, but it is a global issue at the same time, not at least because those pictures, those television pictures of the accident were in every living room all over the world, and therefore they are changing the basic issues of the perception on technology and those issues. It is very important to make a distinction between risk and catastrophe, in my theory. Catastrophe is not risk. Risk is the anticipation of catastrophe in the present in order to avoid the catastrophe from happening. It's important to make a distinction between catastrophe and risk. Therefore, risk is actually a mobilizing force, a huge mobilizing force, because it demonstrates that we are facing a potential catastrophe, and therefore it activates all kinds of actors, maybe even new concepts are coming up. We can see this in all the big issues we are discussing now. For example, even in the European crisis, in the Euro crisis, suddenly all kinds of new ideas of banking union, of financial transaction tax, all those issues come up as a real issue to answer those potential catastrophes. There's a lot of misunderstanding in relation to individualization. I make a clear distinction between individualism as the philosophy, as the ideology, as something which is related to a long history of thoughts. Actually, this kind of individualism is pretty much a production of modernity. In early ages, it was very difficult to be an individual because then you were actually seen as somebody totally outside of society. But this has become dominant. But the ideological or philosophical aspect of individualization has clearly to be distinguished with individualization, individualism and individualization. And individualization is related to structures, to institutions. For example, the basic rights, social rights, political rights, all those rights, civil rights, are addressed to the individual. And therefore we have an individualized individualization. And this is a process which is going on since the 19th century in Europe. And it's ongoing. It's not being stopped. So the talk about me society or all those criticism of this individualism doesn't get the point. Of course, capitalism and market economy is an important contribution to this process as well. But it means that in modern society, traditions are being dissolved and the individual is getting more and more the subject to organize his own life, even if he or she doesn't have the resources to do so. For example, education or basic rights and the possibility to organize a life by themselves. This is, of course, a huge problematic because then the class structure of a society, the radical inequality which we are experiencing at the same time, is not actually seen as a collective issue, not a class issue, but is seen pretty much as a failure of the individual. So individualization has a very ambivalent meaning at the same time. The third process, which I call cosmopolitization, may be even more difficult to understand. I make a distinction between cosmopolitanism, again as a philosophical background, which is a very important idea through the history of philosophy, was a special issue all over Europe during the Enlightenment. Cosmopolitanism on the one hand, and cosmopolitization as again a structural process related to what we normally call globalization. And cosmopolitization is so important because suddenly we realize that the interdependence which we experience, the interconnectedness in all kinds of issues, brings the world which seems to be outside into your own life. Borders don't work in the same way we expect them to work. The other, who is actually living in a different continent, is making decisions which affect your own life. And cosmopolitization means that actually we are living in a time where the other, the distant other, the global other, the stranger, is to some extent included and excluded at the same time. He is included in many ways, sometimes by purpose, sometimes just by structure. By purpose, as an example, nannies, which come from all over the world to work in our households, which is a very common issue nowadays, but on the perspective of a sociologist, it's actually one of the big movements of migration at the beginning of the 21st century. It's very much individualized, and now even our households are interconnected to people from other worlds. Those mothers work for children not of their own in foreign countries, and at the same time often have children at home. So actually motherhood is a transnational issue, and this transnational issue is again becoming right inside of national society is an important experience. So this is important from a sociological perspective because you cannot analyze households just on a national basis. You have to find out how to define the unit of research and make specific comparisons in order to just find out what's happening in a French household, in a German household, British household, and so on. But on the other hand, maybe even more important for our political situation and the backlash to renationalization in many issues is that even the workers, if they are still only living in the normal national way of life and work, are feeling threatened by cosmopolitization because their laborhood, their competence can be substituted, potentially substituted by somebody far away which he or she doesn't know. So actually the background for renationalization in Europe, but many other countries, is this experience of being potentially substituted, and therefore actually to some extent the economic other is becoming your personal enemy. And this is the situation again. So cosmopolitization means that our frame of reference, our way of looking at the world doesn't work anymore. We cannot work from a sociological point of view. We cannot work in national in national units of research. I make a distinction, I think, which is one of the most important discussions now in the social sciences between methodological nationalism and methodological cosmopolitanism. Methodological nationalism is the critique that most of the social sciences, in their theory, in their research design, in the production of data, are still prisoners of the nation state. They relate from the history of their existence to the nation state as a basic unit to develop categories, to make research, to collect data, etc. But now we are living in an interconnected world where actually the nation state is of course still important, but it's not just giving the idea about the reality we experience. We are interconnected. The other is becoming part of our own life experience, of our work experience, of our political experience. So we need a new frame of reference. This is actually my field of research. I'm having a project now on cosmopolitan methodology, methodological cosmopolitanism. A very interesting team who is working on this for 5 years, and I'm trying to develop methodological cosmopolitanism in relation to climate change issue, trying to demonstrate that climate change actually needs a cosmopolitan perspective. You cannot talk even about climate change if you just concentrate on the nation state. I think this is actually what makes climate change so important and interesting. But at the same time, you cannot look at it only from a national point of view. You cannot just concentrate on nation states. So we are looking at world cities, and not only at world cities as actors in climate change issues, but also the interconnectedness of world cities. We're trying to find out if there are new cosmopolitan communities of shared fate between different world cities in order to reinvent many issues of modernity. If I go a little bit further to this paradigm shift I have in mind, I think we need a distinction between two types of social and political theory. The first one, and this is actually the conventional and dominant social and political theory, is about reproduction of social and political order. This is one of the main questions of sociology from the beginning. How is the structure, the order of society being reproduced? But now we live in a situation where actually this reproduction blinds us to the main events and dynamics of modernity. So the other point of view, starting point of construction of social theory, is about the transformation of social and political order. And if we once for a moment look at the dominant theories, nowadays, but even to the classics to some extent, but let's concentrate on the social theories nowadays. For example, Pierre Bourdieu, a very sophisticated, fantastic sociologist of classes, looking at the, let's say, social change of class units and the meaning of class, but still his main point of theorizing is about the reproduction of class society, even among all the breaks of history we experienced in the 20th century. And it's similar with, for example, Foucault. So sophisticated historical perspective of theory and social sciences. I learned a lot from him, but at the same time, his main point is that whatever happens, power is being reproduced. You can do whatever you want, whatever is coming up. It's not a transformation, it's all inclusive into the reproduction of power. In Germany, it's Niklas Luhmann who is arguing that actually theories are even beyond actors and they are reproducing the reality without even related to those dynamics. And Jürgen Habermas is a special case because on the one hand he picks up those transformative perspectives, but at the same time he still believes that late capitalism is reproducing itself. And I think if you relate to the big experiences we have, like I call them in risk society, but they are actually those explosive, politically explosive events we have, you could even say it would be a nice case if we would still control and reproduce order, because this order in itself is being transformed. And we don't have a way to conceptualize and analyze this kind of transformation. Therefore, we are actually, as social scientists, often blind to those huge challenges and conceptual missing conceptual means to just find out what the world is about. And I think transformation needs, again, has two aspects. One is that the transformation has a goal, has something where it is going to, and this was actually the experience of Eastern Europe in the post-communist system, because I talked to many of the intellectual and social science. There were lots of interesting political ideas coming up, but when transformation got the main issue, then all this was forgotten, because it was actually a political technocratic transformation to the Western system of capitalism and democracy. And I don't mean this kind of transformation where you have a real goal. We are living in a time of transformation which doesn't have a goal, which doesn't have an ideology, which doesn't have actually a clear actor, which is part of a side effect of not the crisis, but the success of modernity, which changes the whole world we are living in. And one of the main examples of this is indeed climate change. Well, climate change is actually the issue, the problem, the phenomenon where we really can start go into details about transformation, what it really means, the different aspects, and I would like to do this for a moment. First of all, I think we have again to distinguish between catastrophe and risk in those dimensions. On the one hand, all kind of catastrophes are happening already, all kind of disasters are happening already. They have the problem to be identified as mankind-made catastrophes. They appear as natural catastrophes, though there's a distinction between man-made natural catastrophe and non-man-made natural catastrophe. And this is so important from a sociological point of view, because actually only the man-madeness of catastrophe introduces the political dynamics, even if we still can look, of course, at catastrophes, and we have to find some kind of adoption for those catastrophes as well. But on the one level, we have this discussion about catastrophes and its man-madeness, and here comes one issue up which, in comparison to other global risk is again very important. Climate change is, let's say, socially invisible. You cannot make actually this distinction. A catastrophe doesn't say by itself that it is man-made catastrophe. So here we have those issues, but at the same time we have global risk definition of climate change, which means that we are anticipating, in a radical sense, the end of civilization we are experiencing. It is not a minor, small risk, but it's actually an apocalyptic imaginary, which we are imagining as a kind of, as I said, I would use the term of emancipatory catastrophe in order to make this not happen. We are looking at climate change as a global risk, which means catastrophe, the anticipation of catastrophe is producing maybe even an emancipatory moment, a moment in which all societies and all politics can be shaken up. So I think this is, again, the sociological, theoretical dimension of climate change. And one element I would like to point out, in this distinction between the catastrophe and risk, a moment of hope is introduced. There are actually 2 points which make this specific for politics of climate change. The one is this vision of this concept of global risk is against what I would call catastrophic realism, which only looks at catastrophe and doesn't realize that actually the anticipation of catastrophe is the important moment about climate change, which makes us think and rethink a lot of categories. On the other hand, it's not easy emancipation. It's not just about emancipation. It's of course about something which is such a big concern that we don't even have any answers, because suddenly our civilization is facing its own end, its possible end. So this is what I call emancipatory catastrophism, and I think we have to go even a little bit more into details on this issue, because here's a specific, my specific perspective on climate change comes in. I said it earlier. I said actually climate change is about side effects, and side effects which means creating global risks which undermine our institutions. This was a basic idea of reflexive modernization. But there has to be a distinction between first-order side effects, when we look at those disasters which already happened and which are anticipated, and second-order side effects of side effects. And the amazing thing is, if you just take a moment to think this distinction, to look at the side effects of climate change, then you find that those side effects do concentrate or do make visible all kind of changes which are happening, which are related to some extent to this emancipatory moment of climate change. You find out that even if nothing happens on the political dimension, as we always say, alone the anticipation of climate change from a sociological point of view changes the landscape of the world, the power landscape of the world, the moral landscape of the world. Just to give you a few examples of what I have in mind. First of all, climate change, because there is a necessity to cooperate beyond national borders in order first to see this problem and to find solutions for it. This could be made into an antidote to war. If you believe in climate change, war is actually no answer anymore, because there is a higher threat from catastrophe to humanity, which makes your own interest, the interest of nations, your personal interest, becoming part of the interest of all in order to cope with this issue. This is, of course, not real politics, but it's a frame of reference which is being produced by the perception of climate change. The next issue is, if you look at climate change and take it seriously, there is a huge opposition to neoliberalism, to capitalism in its old way. And you can go on. Even the poorest countries of the world are getting suddenly, and those who are mostly threatened by the consequence of climate change, even if there's no solution, suddenly get a public voice, a world public voice. They are listened, they're being part, they're organized on the conferences, and so on. There's a discussion about our lifestyle. Shouldn't we have to change the lifestyle? Don't we need new kinds of organizations which fit to this new setting? So what I'm saying is, I'm not optimistic. I'm not saying that actually those frames, those issues are the solution to climate change. But I'm saying sociologists have a special point of view. They look empirically at the change which is happening, or the transformations which are happening only and because we are anticipating the global risk of climate change. And then we have two aspects. We have the first aspect of the disaster as a side effect, and on the other hand we have the consequences of these side effects, and we see that actually society and politics is moving. And we have to relate to this real moving of society. And this, I think, could be the specific contribution of social sciences to climate change. And you could even go one step further, maybe radicalizing this idea. And I sympathize with this argument. I'm not quite sure if I can live with the argument, but I'm sympathizing with it. Because I would like to construct this argument and do empirical research about climate change, even to take the skepticism, the denier of climate change on board. I'm trying to argue, even if you don't believe in climate change, the politics we need, the transformations we need, could be part of your own vision of the future of modernity. So even if people are not certain about the difference about man-made catastrophe and non-man-made catastrophe, sociologists could open up a perspective that the politics which are coming up, the changes of politics, are acceptable even to those who deny the reality of climate change. No, I think it goes beyond this, what I have in mind. It's more than just a reformation of modernity. I'm first of all concerned that actually the most sophisticated social theorists, or maybe even social scientists, or maybe even natural scientists, are now becoming climate pessimists. They're not skepticists, but they're pessimists, because they don't see that reality is really basic changing and that we are really going to face a catastrophe. And here I want to say this isn't the whole picture. And it's part of your own thinking. You are blocked to see the ambivalence of climate change. And why are you blocked? Because you cannot see the transformation of politics. Let me give you an example for this. I think Tony Giddens, a very good friend of mine, as well as a different kind, in a different way, Bruno Latour, a very good friend of mine too, both seem to take into account all the transformation I was talking about. Even maybe Bruno Latour even more than Tony Giddens. But at the same time, they stick to the old dualism of politics. Giddens' book is about national and international politics, and he doesn't even think that this dualism doesn't work anymore. And Bruno, in his newest essays and papers, says actually the friend-foe distinction is still the only distinction to make politics work in this situation. And I think this is an inconsequence in thinking the transformative dynamics we are living in. They stop the transformative idea when it comes to politics, and thereby they are producing only pessimistic visions of the future of catastrophe. And I'm not neglecting those kind of problems. We are still stuck in a nation-state situation. It's not overcome. There's international, national politics. There are the distinction between friend and foes. But at the same time, there's a transformative perspective, which means that actually our interests, friends and foes, our national interests or whatsoever, are being transformed. They are not essentially the same way as they have been during first modernity. And this opens up, this is a new space for even redefining not only political institutions, but the idea and the concept of the political. And I think here comes in this cosmopolitan moment, because for the first time in history, we are not only confronted in friend-foe distinction, but the friend-foe distinction is becoming something which is connected to the endangerment of everyone and everything at the same time. And this makes a difference. There's a cosmopolitan moment in the distinction which you can experience it in a very concrete sense, because of course, climate change does have all kind of new conflicts, producing new conflicts. For example, between those who are threatened in their existence because they live close to coastal areas or in specific areas that are more dangerous than other ones. But at the same time, they bridge the old differences. You know, the old national differences are to some extent disappearing and new ones are coming up. So this is what I mean. There's a new definition of politics coming up, which we cannot capture only by the old concepts. And I think this is my point. The pessimism of even natural scientists and social scientists, who are actually those who are the best thinkers in those issues, is produced by not really taking the transformative impetus, the transformative imperative seriously. How could you envision, how could you see this transformative consequences, and what implications does it have for our political vision, but for political action as well? Well, first of all, I think we have to realize that this cosmopolitan perspective or outlook is a new frame of reference in which we see the same differently. If you look at climate change from a cosmopolitan point of view, you don't have the solution, but you see there are different aspects. There are new aspects which I didn't see so far. And one of those aspects is that climate change does change the political landscape, and not only to a worse situation. It opens up new kind of imaginaries, new kinds of possibilities. They are not the solution, but they are reality. This is, for example, the case in many social movements or in everyday experiences. Suddenly people care about consumption habits in different kinds of the world. And they feel a kind of solidarity to those who do this in different areas of the world. For example, Ute Habermas, the woman of Jürgen Habermas, told the story how amazed they were that their grandchild makes them turn off the water because this is something which they shouldn't open up the water when they bathe their teeth, because this is something which is a necessary answer to the threat of climate change and resources. So there are suddenly all kind of moral and political imperatives coming up between national context, which we know, but we didn't organize themselves, or they're not part of our political organ. To some extent they are, but they are not really. The second aspect comes back to the project I'm making, the empirical project. I say to my empirical ideas, I would say nations have a hard time in making this cosmopolitan moment of climate change, to realize this and to make it real, to use it for new kinds of reinventing politics. Parties don't do this actually either. But I think global cities are actors where you can visit it. Global cities are not actors which relate actually to the distinction between national and international. They don't, from the history, they seem to try to become independent from their normal surroundings. They are, as we find out in our research, they are being interconnected in issues of climate change. Of course, information networks, but much more than that. They are already trying to organize it. We are trying to find out if there are ways of binding decision-making between world cities. And cities are at the same time places and political spaces in which the invisibility of climate change is overcome because it's a threat to your everyday life. You get sick, and they have to somehow relate to those issues. And if you look once again from a cosmopolitan perspective to cities, you find out that actually those are even there are even let's say professionals, middle classes who are living transnationally, who are having cosmopolitan, everyday cosmopolitan experiences, and they're at the same time powerful in those cities. Conservatives have a hard time in cities nowadays because they somehow experience this new threat and they are reacting to it. I'm not saying that actually the city is the savior of the world now, but I want to say that there are places or actors or arenas in which the basic argument I'm trying to make are getting more relevant than in other cases. One, the research we are doing wants to compare how much of this new cosmopolitanism, this new way of interrelating different actors is happening on the national level or is happening on the city level, and we want to find out how much, what are the conditions for it, what are the resistance, how this is actually being realized, or if it is not realized, and still we don't have any actors in relation to this climate change. Yeah, you asked me how I see the collective future. I'm indeed think that even Europe is in a bad shape now. If you look at its history, it is the best situation Europe has ever been in from a historical point of view. And I'm somehow think that the pessimism, which is now cultural pessimism, which is now dominating our thinking, is intellectual laziness. It's not the whole story, and it doesn't get the transformation or the transformative dynamics we are living in. I would like to make a distinction between, as I would say, the present future and the future future. The present future is the future we anticipate. And we are always talking about this kind of future. It's part of our present anticipation of the future. And I think all the fight is about this, all the conflicts is about this. Can we look at the past to find out about the anticipation of the future? Is it a completely new kind of future which we have to anticipate, so we cannot even look at the past? It's coming to us, a different kind of future. I agree with this perspective. But I would say it's still a difference between the anticipated future and the future future. The future future is open, and we cannot anticipate it. We cannot even think about it. We don't have the concepts to analyze the future future. Maybe this is the way we are beyond modernity. This is not modernity in the sense anymore that we have the instruments and the ideas to manage or control this kind of modernity. And this isn't a bad thing. Many people would say this is a bad thing. It's a bad thing because we can really relate and cope with the old instruments and categories to this future, but it's opening up at the same time. And the open future is politics. And we are asked to take part in this politics.